All right, everybody, welcome to day 29. Whew, we're getting close. 2 videos to go. And if you want me to be frank, I'm getting a little stressed out because we have so much to cover. All right, so like I said at the end of the last episode, we are mostly done with the front end portion. We still have to construct a form later, but yeah, most of the boring stuff, quote unquote, is all done. So in this video, we will move on to the architecture of the application. Now, I know already that it's an employer who will publish a job. So I'm going to start with a migration to create that table. Create employers table. All right. Create employers table. And yeah, let's see. An employer has a name. That'll be a string. They have a logo. So we will store a path to that logo. And then also an employer belongs to a user, right? A user signs up, they create an employer, and it is the employer who publishes the job. All right, let's do a foreign ID for a user. And of course, we can clean this up. All right, let's migrate the database. PHP artisan migrate. All right, so we have 3 tables that Laravel ships with out of the box, and then our new employers table. If I switch to Table Plus, let's open it. It's an SQLite connection. I'll give it a name and the path. So here's our app. It's going to go into database.sqlite. Save it. And yeah, now we have our new employers table. Okay, so while we are here though, jobs and job batches and failed jobs. You'll remember throughout the course, because Laravel has a concept of queued jobs that kept interfering with our concept of a job listing. So yeah, I don't want any interference. So what I'm going to do is change these default table names. Go into your config directory down to queue, and let's have a look. I'm just going to look for table. Yeah. So for the database connection for our queue driver, the default table name is jobs. So why don't we change this to queued jobs? Or again, we could store this directly within your environment file. All right, let's do another table search. Job batches. We didn't really go over this. It's a slightly higher level concept, but nonetheless, I'm going to use the same convention here. It will now be called queued job batches. And I think there's one more. Yeah. So if a queued job runs, but it fails for some reason, it needs to be stored, right? So that we can reference it later and retry it later. So that table is called failed jobs by default. Now it's going to be queued failed jobs. All right, so now we just have to update the migration itself. So this is the migration that Laravel ships with, create jobs table. And yeah, let's start by renaming it to create queued jobs table. And then I will update the table names. Queued jobs, queued job batches, and then finally queued failed jobs. Okay, let's refresh our migrations. PHP artisan migrate fresh. And now, if I switch back to Table Plus and give this a refresh, all right, now, there won't be any interference whatsoever with our job model. Okay, so let's do this. We did this in 2 steps, didn't we? We created a migration for the employers table, and now I'm going to create a model for the employer. But don't forget, if I do help on make model, we can generate these things all in one go, including the migration, including a factory, including a controller. Or if we pass the -a flag, it makes a migration, the model, the seeder, the factory, the policy, the resource controller, and a form request. Yeah, there's a lot here, but it really does save a bunch of time. Okay, but anyways, because we already created the migration, this time let's build the model and I will select the ones that I need. So -C for controller, F for factory, -S for a database seeder, and then I also want a policy. Cool, so now we get 5 files with a single command, which is pretty cool. Okay, next up, let's focus on jobs. And this time we'll do it all in one go. PHP artisan make model job -all. And yeah, now we get all of these files for free. And yeah, keep in mind, if it turns out that there's one maybe form request that you're not going to use, just hit the delete key. No problem there. All right, so let's go into our migration, create jobs table. And let's see, let's think this through. To publish a job, we need to provide the title of the job, right? What's the job title? Next, what is the salary for the job? And yeah, once again, we're going to be pretty generic here. I don't want to deal with currencies and stuff like that. So you can provide whatever you want for that field. All right, next, another string. What is the location for this job? Is it remote, or do you have to be in Winter Park, Florida? It just depends. So you need to specify that. All right, next, what is what should we call this? The type of work. Is it full-time or part-time? And maybe type isn't the right term. Maybe schedule? That's not quite right either. Why don't we go schedule, though? It could be full-time or part-time, and we'll set a default of full-time. Yeah, if you want, this could be an enum, but I don't know. Sometimes that's a little annoying to work with on the database level, so I will skip that. All right, next up, when you publish a job, you need to provide a link to your actual job details page. Believe it or not, that's how it often works. You publish your job to some kind of aggregate platform, but then it ultimately directs you to your own website where you provide more details. So this will be a URL to the actual job listing. And then, well, here's another thing. I don't know if we're going to implement this, but yeah, you could imagine allowing users to pay more to have their job listing featured at the top. So we need some way to determine if a job should be featured or not. So with that in mind, let's make that a Boolean. It'll be featured, but the default is false. And then finally, the relationship. A job belongs to an employer, right? So let's set a foreign ID for the employer. And then once again, I will import that. All right, that looks good to me. Let's migrate our database. Back to Table Plus, give it a refresh. Now we have users, we have jobs, and we have employers. Very cool. So now I'm going to set up those relationships. Let's start with employer. An employer belongs to a user. So return, this is a belongs to relationship, and then we reference the associated model. And if you want, you can add a return type or you can omit it. Just depends on what system you want to follow. All right, now let's do the inverse. So in this case, the user is actually like the representative for the employer. So it's not a belongs to relationship. It's actually a has one relationship. So a user has one employer. Like so. All right, next, let's switch over to job. So what are the relationships for a job? Well, as we discussed, a job belongs to an employer, right? Of course it does. All right, next, once again, let's do the inverse. If I have an employer instance and I want to see all jobs associated with that one employer and no one else, well, let's do that. Jobs, and this is going to be a has many relationship. An employer has many jobs. And again, if you want, you can add a type here. Just make sure that you import it at the top here. Now, real quick, we're making good progress, but I do want to introduce testing at least a little bit. It's a tricky thing. Testing is a key component to building applications these days, but for a beginner level course, it slows things down dramatically. But nonetheless, we want to discuss it at least a bit. So I'm not going to write tests for this entire project like I would do in real life, but we'll write some to give you the general approach. All right, let's do that now. So let's do this. Before I can write some tests, I first want to flesh out my database factories. So let's go into factories and build these out. All right, so let's see. An employer has a fake name. It has a fake logo. So let's see if there's some kind of image URL. Yeah, I think that'll work. And then finally, an employer belongs to a user, right? So let's reference a user factory. All right, that's done. Now into job factory. And a job has a title. So I believe Faker has a job title property, which is pretty cool. They have a salary. And here's what I'll do in this case. This is a cool little tip. There is a random element method where you can pass an array, and Faker will just choose a random item from that array. So for example, you could say 50,000 USD, like we've been doing, 90,000 USD, or 150,000 USD. So now every single item will be one of these three. All right, next we said location. I'm just going to hard code that to remote. And also, that's an important thing to realize. It doesn't always have to be random fake data. If you need to hard code it, that's fine. It doesn't matter. Next we have schedule, and we'll set that to full time. Or again, if you want it random, use random element. Next, we need a URL to the job listing page on the employer's website. So we'll do fake URL. Is the job featured? We're just going to always set it to false unless you override it. And then finally, the relationship, employer ID. So we can say employer factory. All right, so let's clean that up and we're all set. Okay, so now we can write some tests for this. So let's come down into phpunit.xml. So keep in mind, even though we're using a test framework called Pest, Pest is a wrapper around phpunit. So that's why we can visit a phpunit.xml file to configure how Pest is going to behave, because Pest is just deferring to phpunit. It's a wrapper. Anyways, you can see some of these environment variables that are set. These are like overrides when you're in a testing environment. So I'm going to set up the database connection to also be SQLite, but I can set the database itself to not be a file, but instead memory. And yeah, you won't always reach for this, but for small little projects like this, it's going to be perfect and super fast. Next, notice other things like sending mail or dealing with queues. Yeah, all of that is effectively turned off. We don't actually want to deliver an email when we are performing a test. We just want to assert that an email was sent. So in these situations, we use the array driver rather than SMTP or postmark or something like that. All right, let's create a test. PHP artisan make test. I am testing my jobs. And now what kind? Feature or unit? This can often be confusing. Think of a feature test as testing a wide spectrum of your application, like this. When I visit such and such page, I expect to see that. Or when I make a post request to this controller, then validation should occur and I should see such and such in the database. Think about it. That's testing a very wide range of your project versus a unit test, which is far more narrow. When I instantiate this class and I call that method, then I expect such and such in response. And yeah, how narrow that ends up being differs based on the community. So for example, would testing an eloquent model that hits the database, is that a unit test? Some people say absolutely not. I say, sure, who cares? But again, just make up your own mind. In our case, we are working with quote unquote unit tests. Okay, so let's open that up. It will be within your test directory in unit. And now we have our new job test. Now, we already have an example here. Expect true to be true. Nice and readable. Let's run it. PHP artisan test. Okay, so we have the example tests that Laravel ships with. And if we want, we can go ahead and delete those. Or just the one for unit for now. And yeah, the one we care about here is our job test. And of course, it passes. But if we change this, expect true to be false, of course, that's going to fail. So if I run it again, now we get red. All right, let's review a few examples. Let's say a job belongs to an employer. So I could say test, it belongs to an employer. But as it turns out with Pest, we can use this function name of test, or we can use an alternative alias, which is it. And you can switch between those based upon how you want to write out your tests. So notice I'm saying test that it belongs to an employer. That's great. Or I could say it belongs to an employer. Both do the exact same thing. So how would I check this? Well, and this is usually a 3-step process. We often call it arrange, act, assert, AAA. Like this. Begin by arranging the world. Create the world in order to run your test. Next, act. Perform some kind of action. Finally, assert. What did you expect to happen as a result of that assertion? All right, so I'll show you an example. It belongs to an employer. How do I arrange the world here? Well, if it belongs to an employer, then I probably need an employer to perform this action, right? Let's use a factory for that. Employer, factory, create. All right, next we are using it. It refers to a job, but I don't have a job currently. So let's do that as well. Let's say job equals job factory create. Now, when I run this, it is true. It'll set up its own relationship to an employer. But for this particular test, I want to be a little more explicit. So if I ever want to override anything declared within the factory, then I pass that as an array to the create method. So in our case, I want to override employer like so. Okay, and while we're here, let's clean things up. All right, so now step 1, arrange is complete. Next up, perform an action. So this is where I interact with the code base in the way that I want. In our case, job, employer. Okay, so often your action and your assertion will be separate, but in this particular case, we can group them into one. Act and assert. All right, so I could say expect job employer to be this, like you see here. So here's what we could do. Job employer is employer. We learned about that method many episodes ago. I expect that to be true. So yeah, if the is method is new to you, it's checking if what you pass here is the current instance. So that will either return true or false. In our case, we expect it to be true. All right, let's run our test. PHP artisan test, but it fails for a confusing reason. A facade root has not been set. All right, so ultimately what's happening here is the Laravel framework hasn't really loaded because this is being treated as a sort of raw, naked unit test. But I do want to interact with Laravel and Eloquent in the database. So if I go into the pest.php file, this is sort of like the configuration file for your tests. And right at the top, you can see use this root parent class in the feature directory. Now, you can think of test case almost like Laravel. It makes and bootstraps Laravel for you. And you'll also see this commented line, refresh database. And what this means is after every test completes, Laravel will refresh and reset the database so that you can start with a clean slate. All right, so these things will be active in the feature folder right here, but I also want them in my unit folder. And yeah, this goes back to how different people have different ideas for what a unit test should encompass. In my case, I'm pretty loose with it, so I'm going to use these two parent classes or traits within the unit and the feature folder. All right, now if I run it again, it passes. Perfect. So it passed, if I switch back, because we have already set up these relationships. So if I go into job and we hadn't yet written this, we would run the test, it would fail, and at that point, we could write the code in order to make it work. And this is referred to as test-driven development. Yeah, I find that test-driven development can be a little confusing to newcomers, but it's actually not so bad, especially with Laravel these days. Think of it like this. You start by writing a test where you interact with the world, and in this case, the world is your code base. You interact with the world in a way that is ideal to you. Next, you run the test. But of course, the test is going to fail, right? You haven't written any of this code in real life. You're in La La Land. You're saying, wouldn't it be great if this worked? But of course, it doesn't. So the test returns red. It fails. So the final step is write the code to make the test pass. And then rerun the test. It returns green, and you rinse and recycle. It's a nice way to build applications. It's not for everything, but in certain scenarios, you're really going to love it. Anyways, if we return this code and run the test again, it passes. Now, I do want to show you at least one example of this TDD approach. So how about a post can have tags? That can be useful. So how about it can have tags? All right, let's follow arrange, act, assert. Create the world. Well, to start, I want a job. So job, factory, create. All right, next, act. So interact with the world in the way that would be ideal. So if I want to attach a tag to my job, maybe I could even call a method like tag. Job, tag it with front end or something like that. Finally, assert. Assert that this worked the way I would expect. Maybe something like this. I would assume on my job model, I would have a tags collection. And maybe I could say, well, I expect that collection to have one item. So I could say to have count 1. And I'll reformat. Yeah, why don't we start with that? All right, so let's come back and run our tests. And of course, it fails. There is no method called tag. All right, let's implement that. Job, tag. All right, so we fixed that particular error. It said no tag method exists, so we run it again. And now we have changed the error. And this is a key part of test-driven development. Make the error change. And that is a signal that you are, in fact, making progress. Okay, so now we tried to grab a collection, but of course that returns null and it's not working. Okay, let's do that now. We will have a tags relationship. And why don't we just stub it out for now? Let's return an empty array. All right, it fails, the error changes, and now, job tags must return an Eloquent relationship instance. Okay, now we can get to work. Let's make a model for a tag. And I don't know if we're going to get around to building a controller for it, but I do want a factory and a migration. All right, so let's go into create tags table. And this is very simple. A tag consists of a unique name, like front end, back end, manager, project lead. And actually, for now, I think that's fine. All right, now let's go into tag factory and set this up. A tag factory has a name of any kind of fake and unique, so I will add that classifier name, and that will be fine. All right, so now I can go into job, and yeah, let's update this relationship. So does a job belong to a tag? Well, that would signal that the tag owns the job, right? And no, that doesn't really make sense. What about the inverse? Does the tag belong to the job? Well, sort of, right? If I had a tag called front end, that could belong to this job. The only thing is, it could belong to more than one job. It could belong to 10 different jobs. So it's non-exclusive. Okay, so in these situations, we want a belongs to many relationship, and we'll create a pivot table to allow for that. All right, so our relationship is belongs to many. A job can belong to and have many tags. All right, so we have a tag eloquent model. We have a job eloquent model. Next, we need an intermediate table. And this table will include the job ID and the tag ID. And it'll do that over and over. That way, one job could potentially have 100 different tags that it is associated with. Let's create a migration. PHP Artisan, make migration, create job tag table. All right. All right, so we want a foreign ID for the job, right? And then we want another one for the tag. And for both of these, why don't we say constraints, create a foreign key constraint, and then cascade on delete. And we've already reviewed both of these. This just means if, in this example, if the tag is deleted, then cascade and also delete the record within this pivot table as well. Okay, PHP Artisan migrate. So now I have a new tags table and a job tag pivot table. All right, so we've done some work. I'm now going to return to job test, and let's see how we're doing. PHP Artisan test, and it still fails. Failed asserting that actual size 0 matches expected size of 1. Well, at least we are making progress. Let's go back into job, and let's see. That relationship is working, but right now the tag method doesn't do anything at all. So let's update this. If I accept a tag name here, we'll call it name. Now, there's a couple ways to do this. I'm going to reference the tag model. So I'm going to say, give me the first tag from the database table that has this name. Or if you couldn't find one with that name, create or persist one in that table. So I'm going to say the name is name. All right, does that make sense? Give me the tag from that table, and if you couldn't find a tag with that name, create one, and then give me the tag. All right, next, I'm going to interact with my pivot table. I can say this, tags, and attach a new tag here. Just like that. All right, finally, these squiggly lines, my editor just wants return types. Again, these are optional depending on how you like to build your applications, but we could import these and simplify. All right, let's run our tests again. And it fails, but I want you to notice right here, yeah, check this out. Add name to the fillable property to allow mass assignment on tag. Yeah, so notice when we take this approach, it almost feels like the tests are telling you what the next thing you need to do is. And that's one of the huge benefits to this approach. All right, let's go on to tag, and we could update the fillable property, or I'm going to go into App Service Provider, and I'm going to disable that feature entirely, like we've learned about in past videos. So I can say model unguard. All right, run it again, and now we get green. How cool is that? We haven't yet opened a browser, but now we know that a job belongs to an employer, and it can be associated with any number of tags. All right, let's be done with tests. That's all we can get done here. Let's go into our routes file. And yeah, all we have right now is the homepage route. Let's update this. When you visit the homepage, that will load our new job controller and an index action on it. All right, let's open that up. And this can still load our welcome view, though we should probably change that, shouldn't we? So let's go into resources, views. I'm going to have a directory called jobs. and then a view called index.blade.php. And what I'll do is I'll take everything here and migrate it over, and then I can delete welcome entirely. All right, back to job controller. Now, as you can imagine, and let's update this, we would need to pass jobs to our job listing page. And I'm also imagining that we need to pass a list of tags. So let's do that one as well. All right, let's keep it very simple. We can now reference our job model and say, give me all of them. Though, of course, as we've learned, in a real project, we would want to paginate them. But for now, a select star is fine. We'll do the exact same thing for our tags. Okay, let's go into our view. And you'll remember that, in the last episode, everything was static. We're just hard coding all of these. But now we can swap them out. Let's begin with, how about tags? We can say for each tags as tag, then render this blade component. But now I want to pass in the associated tag like this. Tag equals tag. Or a little tip in situations like this where your parameter name and the variable name are the same, if you prefer, you can actually do this. This is just sort of syntactic sugar that achieves the exact same result. All right, so now within tag, I also need to accept the tag. And now I will swap out the text here with the name of the tag itself. Next, we haven't set up an endpoint, but the href would probably be something like tags/tag name to lowercase, maybe. Yeah, but we haven't set that up yet. Okay, let's go back to jobs.index. So we've updated this one here, but also we reference tags within the job cards, don't we? This should be easy. Now we know a job can have tags. For each job tags as tag, then reference the tag. All right, let's copy this and then also switch back to job card wide. And yeah, we have this one right here. Get rid of this, and the size can be the default. All right, let's view this in the browser. Yeah, of course. I jumped ahead of myself. So within job card, we're referencing a variable called job that was not defined. Of course, each of these need to be updated to now accept the job. So here's job card wide. I will then go into job card and paste that in. And then within our job/index view, we can pass these in the exact same way. For each jobs as job, pass it in. All right. And then I'm going to do the same thing up here, but do note this is the feature jobs. So we will need to tweak this in just a little bit. But yeah, let's just get to a point where the page loads. All right, come back, cross our fingers, and the page is loading. Now you'll notice, of course, we don't see any tags or jobs because we don't have any yet. So this is where database seeders come into play. We'll go into database seeders, job seeder, and let's do this now. So yeah, this is sort of like a whirlwind tour of the entire course up until this point. Job, factory, let's create, 20 of them. Create. Now, keep in mind, this will work, but it doesn't account for tags. So here's what we'll do. I'm also going to say tag factory 3 create. So I'm going to create a collection of 3 random tags. And now I'm going to call a new method you haven't seen called hasAttached. And of course, this is for belongs to many relationships. I want to attach these tags to each of these jobs we generate. So now every single job will consist of these 3 tags. All right, let's go to database seeder. I will create our dummy user. That's fine. And then we will call our job seeder. All right, let's give it a shot. PHP artisan db seed. If I come back to Table Plus, now we have a bunch of employers, we have a bunch of jobs, and we have 3 tags. And whoops, I accidentally did a person's name instead of a word. I'll fix that. But anyways, 3 tags that each of these jobs are associated with. And we can see those references here. All right, let's fix that real quick. Tag factory. And let's use a dummy word here. All right, PHP artisan migrate fresh -- seed. Reset my migrations, rerun them, and then seed the database. Let's go to Arc, give it a refresh, and now we have actual live data coming from our database. Pretty cool. And then we have 3 tags, and notice every single job is associated with them. Okay, so just a couple final things. I'm going to go into job card and make all of these dynamic. So we'll say job employer name. We want job title, job salary, and then tag. We no longer have to pass this in. And then employer logo, we're going to come back to that. Okay, now let's go to the wide version of the card, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. Job employer. So notice we do have an n+1 issue right now because we haven't eager loaded the employer relationship. So for each item in this loop, we have to perform a new query to fetch the employer. So keep that in mind. Job title, job salary, and same thing here. All right, back to Arc. And now these are unique the way we'd expect. Okay, so the last thing I can fit in here is feature jobs. Right now, we're getting the exact same collection. So notice the first one is psychiatric technician. And then if I come down here to recent jobs, we see the exact same thing. There's no distinction between a featured job and a non or unfeatured job. Let's do this. I'm going to come back to our job seeder. And we know that in some cases, we could set featured to false, and other cases, featured to true. So I could run 2 separate queries, or this is a slightly more advanced concept, but we could create a sequence instead. And it takes this shape, new sequence. And notice that full import there. I'm going to provide a sequence of parameters that I want Laravel to filter through, or better, iterate through. For example, sometimes featured will be set to false, and why don't we set schedule to full-time? All right, but then in the next iteration, featured will be set to true, and schedule will be set to part-time. All right, so let's reformat. And if we did everything correctly, we should now have, for a total of 20, 10 of them with these attribute overrides set, and another 10 with these attributes. Let's give it a shot. I will run migrate fresh seed. And now, check this out. I'm going to go into job controller, and let's extract this. Call it jobs, all right? And I'm going to say job all, but after we fetch them, I want to group them according to whether or not they are featured. So check this out. I'm going to return this from the controller so that we can review the JSON. And let's see, let's do pretty print. All right, so notice we have a collection of collections now. So for the first array, in every case, featured is set to 0. But after we get to 10 or so, we get a new array or a new collection. And for this one, featured is set to 1 for all of the items. So we have grouped these into collections based upon whether or not they are featured. Cool. So now here's what we could do. We could, let's do this. We'll have featured jobs as well. So that's the first item from this collection here. And the second item is the unfeatured jobs. So if we want, we could do something like that. All right, so let's go into our view. And now I can loop over featured jobs instead. Okay, so now down here, this will be standard jobs. And you know what? This probably isn't quite right because presumably you would want featured jobs included with your recent jobs. But yeah, for now, we're just drawing a distinction between promoted jobs and non-promoted jobs. So as to avoid duplication. Okay, so back to Arc. All right, so now we have our 10 featured jobs, beginning with Human Resource Director, 3, 6, 9, 10. Then our tags, and then unfeatured jobs. And this one is Human Resources Assistant. It's a different collection entirely. Very cool. All right, that's a wrap. And I'm not even joking. I am literally tired right now. There's just so much to cover. And oh my gosh, we only have one more video to do it. So wish me luck. Tomorrow is day 30, and we're going to wrap up this entire course. I'll see you then. What?
Put your arms in the air!
You'll never take me along!
Could be 22 in the street,